The transfer went through at 12:03 a.m., just like it always had. He wasn't even looking for it. The notification surfaced while he scrolled absent-mindedly through his banking app, half asleep, half lost in the familiar numbness that came with quiet nights. $300. Outgoing. Same recipient. Same reference note. Same date. 7 years had passed since his wife was laid to rest. 7 years of seasons changing, faces aging, memories softening around the edges. And yet, every single month, the money still moved, obedient, automatic, unquestioned. At first, it felt comforting, like proof that something from that life hadn't vanished completely. The payments had started in the days after the funeral, when words were fragile and promises were made without thinking about how long grief could last. Her mother hadn't asked directly. She never had to. The need was implied in every phone call, every pause, every sigh that lingered too long. So he paid, month after month, year after year. The transfer became part of his routine. Rent, utilities, groceries, her mother, all filed under life, indistinguishable from the rest. He told himself it was responsibility, loyalty, love that didn't die just because someone else did. That night, though, something felt wrong. He tapped into the transaction history, not with suspicion, but habit. The list scrolled endlessly, a digital timeline of devotion. Then he stopped. One entry caught his eye, not because of the amount of the recipient, but because of the date attached to an early transfer. It sat uncomfortably close to a memory he thought was fixed in stone. He frowned, counting backward in his head. Funeral, hospital, the call in the middle of the night. He remembered those days with painful clarity, or at least he believed he did. The date didn't match. At first, he assumed it was nothing, a processing delay, a system error. Banks made mistakes all the time. But the longer he stared at it, the heavier his chest felt. He scrolled further, finding another entry, and another. Small inconsistencies, barely noticeable unless you were looking for them. He hadn't been looking. The room around him felt suddenly too quiet. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock, the faint buzz of the phone in his hand. All of it sharpened. The transfer that never stopped had become something else entirely. A thread pulling gently, insistently, at a story he thought was finished. He locked the phone and set it face down, as if the screen itself might accuse him. For the first time in years, the money didn't feel like comfort. It felt like a question, one he wasn't sure he wanted answered. The memory came back to him slowly, the way grief always did, without permission, without order. In the weeks after the funeral, time had stopped behaving normally. Days stretched and collapsed at the same time, marked only by condolences, paperwork, and the dull weight in his chest that never lifted. He remembered sitting at the small dining table, papers spread out in front of him, staring at numbers he didn't care about. Bank forms, insurance documents, things that assumed life would eventually move forward. That was when the payments began. Her mother had been sitting across from him, hands folded tightly in her lap. She hadn't cried then. She'd already used up her tears at the graveside. What she carried instead was something heavier, an emptiness that demanded to be acknowledged. She spoke quietly about bills, about the house feeling too big now, about how her daughter had always taken care of things. She never said the words, "You should help me." She didn't have to. He remembered nodding, barely listening, his mind still replaying the last conversation he'd had with his wife, the last unanswered text, the last time he'd assumed there would be more time. When he offered to send money each month, it felt less like generosity and more like obligation, something owed to the dead as much as to the living. They didn't write anything down. No agreement. No discussion of how long it would last. Grief made the rules. The first transfer felt temporary, almost symbolic. The second felt necessary. By the third, it felt expected. Each payment brought him a brief sense of relief, a quiet reassurance that he hadn't abandoned the family he'd married into, that he was still a good husband, even in absence. Her mother thanked him every time, but the gratitude was subtle, measured. She never sounded relieved, only resigned, as if this was how things were supposed to be now, as if the money wasn't help, but continuation. Over time, The payments stopped feeling like a choice. They became a fixed point, anchoring him to a version of the past he didn't know how to let go of. When friends gently suggested it might be time to move on, he bristled. Moving on felt like betrayal. Stopping the money felt unthinkable. What kind of man cuts off a grieving mother? That question stayed with him, shaping decisions he didn't realize he was making. It kept him compliant, quiet, uncurious, until now, sitting alone in the dim light of his living room. He understood something he hadn't allowed himself to see before. The payments weren't just about support. They were about permission. To grieve slowly, to avoid hard questions, to keep the past intact. And contracts, even unspoken ones, have consequences. As he picked up his phone again, a familiar name appeared on the screen. Her mother, calling late, as she often did. He hesitated before answering, suddenly aware that the voice on the other end had never truly let him go. And maybe he realized she never planned to. He answered the call on the third ring. Her voice arrived before any greeting, thin and familiar, carrying the same careful sadness it always had. She asked how he was, though the question felt ceremonial, a doorway to what she really wanted to say. He told her he was fine. He always did. Silence settled between them, not awkward, but practiced. She spoke of small things at first. The weather, a leak in the kitchen ceiling. How quiet the house felt now that winter was coming again. Every detail landed softly, but together they formed a weight he recognized too well. This was how the conversations always went. Gentle reminders of absence, stitched together with vulnerability. He listened, phone pressed his ear, eyes drifting across the room. Nothing in his life felt temporary anymore. Even the furniture seemed arranged around her voice. She mentioned her daughter, his wife, as she always did, slipping her name into sentences as if she were merely away, not gone. She used to love this time of year. She always hated the cold. Present tense. Always present tense. He never corrected her. Correcting her felt cruel, like reopening a wound she refused to let close. When the topic of money surfaced, it wasn't direct. It never was. She spoke instead about rising costs, about how hard it was to manage a loan. She reminded him, subtly, of how much her daughter had worried about her, how responsible she had been, how proud she would be of him. The implication hovered, unspoken but unmistakable. He reassured her without thinking, told her not to worry, told her he'd take care of it. Only after the words left his mouth did he realize how automatic they become, how deeply rehearsed. After the call ended, he stayed where he was, phone still warm in his hand. He tried to picture her mother clearly. The tight smile, the careful tone, the way she never asked outright, but never let him forget either. Grief had hollowed her, yes, but it had also sharpened her. She knew exactly how to keep him close. Looking back, he saw how little space there had ever been for questions. Any attempt at distance was met with disappointment. So quiet it felt worse than anger. Any hesitation was framed as loss, another thing death had taken from her. So he complied. He always had. But now, with the date still burning in his mind, something shifted. Her voice, once comforting, sounded rehearsed. The sadness, once raw, felt preserved, untouched by time. He opened his laptop and searched for old emails, old messages, anything that might anchor memory to fact. He told himself it was just curiosity, a way to ease his mind. Yet as the screen filled with fragments of the past, one thought refused to leave him. Some people mourn by holding on. Others mourn by refusing to let go of anything, or anyone that keeps the truth buried. And for the first time, he wondered which kind of mother he had been listening to all these years. The emails were worse than he expected. He had opened them looking for reassurance, something solid enough to quiet the unease that had settled into his chest. Instead, he found fragments, half-finished conversations, missed replies, threads that ended without explanation. What unsettled him most wasn't what was there, but what wasn't. He cross-checked dates, slowly at first, then with growing urgency. Hospital messages, work notifications, travel confirmations he didn't remember booking. Each timestamp felt like a pin pressed into a memory He thought he understood. Then he found it. A confirmation email, brief, transactional, easy to overlook. It referenced a service appointment scheduled 2 days after the date he had always believed marked the end of everything. He stared at the screen, rereading the line until the words lost meaning. 2 days after she was supposed to be gone. His first instinct was denial. It had to be a clerical error. An auto-generated message that never got canceled. Companies sent these things all the time. Systems were imperfect. Memories were not. Except memories were exactly what had failed him before. He pulled out a notebook from the drawer beside his desk, the one he'd kept during those early weeks of grief. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, as if written by someone else entirely. He flipped through pages filled with dates, names, phone numbers, reminders scribbled in the margins, funeral arrangements, meetings with insurance representatives, conversations he barely remembered having. He found the date again. The same one, circled, underlined, anchored in ink. And yet, the email didn't belong. He leaned back in his chair, eyes closed, trying to reconstruct those days without relying on what he'd been told. He remembered exhaustion, the way hours blurred together, the feeling of being guided from one moment to the next, never quite in control. He remembered her mother handling details, answering questions, stepping in when he couldn't speak. Had he assumed too much? He opened his bank statements next, scrolling back further than before. The first payment, then the second, then a third, one he hadn't noticed until now. The timestamp on that transfer sat uneasily between the date of death and the date of the funeral. He did the math twice. It didn't add up. His pulse quickened as a new thought surfaced, unwelcome and sharp. What the timeline he trusted was assembled for him, not forged outright, just nudged, adjusted, simplified for a man too broken to question it. He thought of her mother's voice, the certainty with which she spoke, the way she corrected him gently when his recollection wavered. No, sweetheart, that was the day before. I remember because always confident, always sure. He opened his calendar app and scrolled back as far as it would go. Most entries were gone, wiped clean by time and device changes. But one reminder remained, synced from an old phone he barely remembered using. A single line. Pick up. The rest was cut off. No date attached. Just a reminder floating free of context, untethered and unfinished. He stared at it until his eyes burned. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls had inched closer while he wasn't paying attention. Every sound seemed amplified. His own breathing felt too loud. He realized he was no longer looking for peace of mind. He was looking for proof. Proof that he hadn't imagined the cracks forming beneath his grief. Proof that the story he'd lived with for years hadn't been carefully edited. Proof that the date meant what he'd always believed it meant. Somewhere in the quiet, his phone buzzed again. A new message notification. Not from her mother this time. From a name he hadn't seen in years. Someone who knew his wife before everything fell apart. He hesitated, thumb hovering over the screen, aware that once he opened it, there would be no going back to ignorance. The date that didn't exist had already undone too much, and whatever waited inside that message threatened to undo the rest. He stared at the name on the screen for longer than he should have. Margot Levin. It had been years since he'd heard it, since anyone outside of immediate family had stepped into this grief-drenched life of his. Margot had been her friend, her confidant, someone who had existed on the periphery of all their shared plans. And now, after so long, she had reached out. The message was brief, almost innocuous. We need to talk. Some things you've been told about her may not be the whole story. His heart tightened. 7 years of quiet certainty, of ritualized payments, of curated memories, had left him unprepared for a conversation that refused to be gentle. He hesitated before replying. The cursor blinked at him like an accusation. Finally, he typed a cautious acknowledgement and waited, staring at the ceiling as if answers could fall from the plaster. The call came the next evening. He remembered the sound of her voice before the words, calm, measured, and yet charged with a tension that made him uneasy. Margot began slowly, almost teasing apart the threads of memory he had thought complete. She wasn't exactly who everyone believed her to be. she said. There was a pause, a soft intake of breath that felt deliberate. And I think some of what you've been told isn't the whole story. He frowned, trying to place her words. Not the whole story? His mind raced back to funeral arrangements, to the bank transfers, to her mother's voice, precise and controlling, shaping his perception of every event. He realized how little he had ever truly questioned anything. Margot's voice continued. She spoke of secrets he had never suspected. Conversations held in hushed tones, distant trips taken without explanation, choices his wife had made that were quietly hidden from him. Each revelation landed like a stone in his chest, small but dense, enough to disrupt the foundation he had built in grief. He listened, rarely interrupting, though a part of him wanted to deny, to deflect, to cling to the comforting version of the past. But the words persisted, insistent and careful, filling the empty spaces between his memories with shadows he could not ignore. She had connections. Things she didn't tell you, Margot added finally. I don't know why, but I know it matters. You need to see them for yourself. The call ended abruptly, leaving only the hum of his apartment and a feeling he hadn't felt in years. Uncertainty. For the first time since her death, the story he had lived would seem incomplete, fragile, and possibly false. Every memory, every ritual, every monthly transfer suddenly felt tinged with doubt. He stared at the phone long after, went silent, heart racing with questions he wasn't sure he wanted to ask. His wife's life, his perception of it, was unraveling thread by thread. And yet, buried beneath the unease, a flicker of something else emerged. Clarity. Perhaps this was a first real opportunity to confront the gaps in his own grief, to understand the life he had shared with her, and the shadows that had been carefully hidden. He opened his laptop again, this time with a deliberate intent. Every message, every file, every document he had ignored or accepted at face value now seemed to carry significance. The voices from the past had returned, not to comfort, not to accuse, but to challenge everything he thought he knew. And deep down he realized the next step wasn't just about discovery. It was about facing truths that might have been buried intentionally. Because sometimes the dead are those who should be. Don't tell the whole story, and the living must uncover it themselves. A single thought settled like a stone in his chest. I'm not ready for what comes next, but it's coming anyway. And with that, he began the slow, careful search that would lead him closer to reality his wife and her mother had kept from him. He hadn't realized how quietly his life had become a ledger of obligation. Every dollar sent, every phone call answered, every careful silence around her name. It was all part of a pattern he had accepted without question. Until now, until Margot's words echoed in his mind, stirring long-buried doubts he hadn't allowed himself to name. He sat at the dining table, staring at the familiar stack of envelopes he still kept from months ago. Each one represented more than money. Each one was a thread tying him to a story he could no longer trust. 7 years of devotion, and yet the past still seemed to laugh at his fidelity, reminding him that loyalty could be both noble and imprisoning. The more he reviewed old messages and bank statements, the more the pattern emerged. Her mother had been careful, almost surgical, in how she spoke, how she guided his decisions, how she framed his grief. Every phone call, every gentle reminder, every sigh of resignation had reinforced an unspoken rule. Pay, don't question, stay. He realized now that he hadn't been helping her. Not really. He had been complying with a quiet, invisible contract, one she had written in the spaces between words, in pauses, in gestures. A contract that demanded loyalty, even as it withheld the truth. The payments hadn't been charity. They had been leverage. He thought back to his own emotions over the years. The relief he felt after sending the money, the brief peace that followed each transaction. It had felt like love. It had felt like honoring his wife. But now, he recognized it as manipulation, not malicious in the obvious way, but precise, subtle, a slow, persistent control that he had mistaken for morality. And the cost? The cost was every missed question, every silenced doubt. Every time he told himself he was doing the right thing, he had stopped noticing his own life, his own needs, even his own instincts. Loyalty, he realized, could be a trap He closed his eyes, imagining a different scenario, one in which he'd asked more questions, spoken more freely, or refused the automatic payment just once. Would it have destroyed the relationship? Or would it have revealed the truth years sooner, before uncertainty dug its claws so deeply into his mind? His phone vibrated against the table. He glanced at it. A message from a number he didn't recognize, but one that seemed connected to the thread Margot had set in motion. Hesitation tightened his chest. Every instinct screamed caution, but he knew the path forward wouldn't allow it. Ignorance had kept him compliant for too long. He typed a short reply, careful not to reveal more than necessary, and then exhaled. The act felt weighty, almost ceremonial, a small step toward breaking free from a pattern that had governed his life for 7 silent years. And yet, as he set the phone down, he felt the old pull, the quiet authority of her mother's presence, even from 1,000 miles away. Loyalty had shaped him. Obedience had kept him safe. But now, every gesture of compliance carried a new awareness. The truth was out there, just beyond reach, and continuing as before would cost more than money. For the first time, he acknowledged it fully. The payments, the calls, the quiet acquiescence, they had not been acts of love alone. They had been acts of survival, of avoidance. And survival, when built on someone else's control, was no longer enough. The next message, the next step, the next answer waited. And he knew, with a cold certainty, that he could no longer ignore it. Because loyalty without understanding, he realized, can be more dangerous than betrayal. With that thought, he opened his laptop again, ready to follow the fragile, twisting trail that would lead him deeper into the story. One truth at a time. The past was no longer just memory. It was a puzzle demanding to be solved. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had survived, something that should have been gone. 7 years of carefully measured grief. 7 years of monthly transfers and polite phone calls, and yet the pieces he was uncovering suggested she hadn't entirely left. Not in the way he had been led to believe. It started with the subtle details. Messages Margot had hinted at, bank notifications that didn't align with the timeline, and small digital traces buried in old accounts. Each one whispered the same unsettling possibility. Maybe she hadn't died, at least not in the absolute way he had accepted. The thought was almost too heavy to bear. His chest tightened, and the room seemed colder, emptier, even though he was the one who had been alone all these years. He thought of her mother's voice, the certainty, the measured grief that never seemed to waver. Could it have been rehearsed or carefully curated? He pulled up old photos, scanning faces, clothing, backgrounds. Everything looked familiar, yet something felt off. There was a fluidity to the past he couldn't reconcile with the fixed dates he had believed were immutable. And the more he looked, the more he noticed absences. The gaps in travel logs, missing tickets, silent days where no one could account for her movements. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was clarity tinged with dread. Her life had continued in ways he couldn't see, ways that had been carefully hidden from him. And if that was true, then every act of loyalty, the payments, the reassurances, the silent acceptance of her mother's influence, had been tied to a version of grief that wasn't entirely real. He remembered the calls, the gentle yet controlling reminders, the way she had been described in present tense. What felt like sorrow had been shaping behavior, guiding him, tethering him to a story that allowed the past to remain manageable. He had been mourning a life that, in some ways, was still in motion elsewhere. The realization was almost unbearable. Every memory of loss, every ritualized gesture, suddenly felt like part of a performance he hadn't realized he was participating in. He could almost hear her mother's careful explanations, her gentle corrections, the subtle insistence that he remembered correctly, all of it framed to keep him compliant, to keep him paying, to keep him silent. He sat back, rubbing his face, feeling the weight of 7 years settle like a stone in his chest. If she had continued living, even quietly, even in ways that didn't involve him, then all his grief had been built on a half-truth. And the payments? Not just support, but unwitting tribute to a story designed to control him. He opened the old laptop again, hesitant but resolute. Every document, every file, every message now carried potential to reveal her true path. He began to track her digital footprint with renewed focus. Social media, emails, public records. Each new clue was a sharp tug, pulling him into an unfamiliar landscape of uncertainty. A single thought lingered in the back of his mind, insistent and cold. If she hadn't ended her life, then someone had been lying to me all along. And if someone had been lying, I needed to know why. He leaned back and let his fingers hover over the keyboard. There was no going back. The story he had accepted as truth was fracturing, and the next step, the confrontation with reality, was unavoidable. Because some lives, he realized, never truly end. They just continue quietly, hidden behind other people's grief, until the truth forces its way to the surface. And he knew, with a tightening in his chest, that he was about to find out where hers had gone. He had rehearsed what he would say for hours. Every step, every word, every possible reaction mapped out in meticulous detail. He knew that calling her mother now would change everything, or perhaps confirm everything he'd begun to suspect. 7 years of compliance, of quiet payments and silent acceptance, had led to this moment. The phone in his hand felt impossibly heavy, a tether to the past that he no longer recognized. He dialed, the tone of the call echoing in the empty apartment. The seconds stretched, each one a heartbeat of tension. Then, click, and her voice answered. Soft, measured, familiar. "Hello, dear," she said. The greeting was neutral, almost casual, but he could hear the weight beneath it, the weight of experience, of someone who had rehearsed grief as carefully as she had rehearsed every interaction with him. He swallowed hard. "We need to talk," he said, the words heavier than he had anticipated. "About everything." A pause. Then, in that quiet that seemed to fill the room, she said, "I thought we already did." That sentence, so simple, carried 1,000 implications. He tried again, forcing his voice steady, but it shook. "No, not everything. There are inconsistencies. Dates, payments, messages. I need the truth." She sighed, almost audibly, the sound of someone who had anticipated this confrontation long before it came. The truth is complicated," she said carefully. "You never needed to know everything." Her words were deliberate, measured, but they weren't answers. They were gates, closed, yet tantalizingly ajar. He pressed on, desperation bleeding into his tone. 7 years, all these payments, all this obedience. Was it for her? Or for you? There was silence this time. Not a pause, but the kind of silence that shapes itself around accusation and reflection. He could almost feel her weighing each word, calculating how much to reveal, how much to withhold. "I did what I thought was best," she said finally, voice low, almost fragile. "I guided you, yes. But you wanted to believe. You made it easier for yourself to believe. That's your choice as much as mine." The admission cut deeper than any lie. He realized that he hadn't been manipulated entirely. He had consented every month, every call, every act of silent acquiescence. His grief had been fertile ground, and he had tended it unknowingly. "What about her?" he asked, his voice shaking now. Was she really gone? She didn't answer immediately. The hesitation stretched into an uncomfortable void. When her voice returned, it was measured, almost rehearsed again. "Some things are better left buried. Not because of me, not because of her, but because of what they would do to you if you knew." He felt a cold twist in his chest. The very act of seeking truth, something he'd imagined as redemptive, was met with the same calculated ambiguity that had guided his life for years. There was no confession, no denial, only carefully crafted silence. "You don't have to tell me everything," he said quietly, almost to himself. "But I need to know if I've been living a lie." Her sigh this time carried fatigue, not sorrow. "You've been living your life the way you chose, the way you were allowed to. The rest is history." He closed his eyes, letting the weight of her words settle. Every nerve in his body screamed for clarity, for confrontation, for a reckoning. Instead, he received restraint, control, and a quiet assertion of authority that left him unmoored. The call ended without resolution. She didn't hang up abruptly, didn't argue, didn't apologize. She simply let the conversation fade, leaving him staring at the dark screen, the dial tone still echoing in his mind. He was no closer to the answers he needed, and yet Paradoxically, he had glimpsed something he hadn't before, the full extent of her mother's influence, the calculated way she had shaped his grief, his loyalty, his obedience. It was unsettling, almost unbearable, but necessary, because now, more than ever, he realized that the search for truth would not come from confession. It would come from the fragments she could not control, the messages, the dates, the faint traces of a life that had never fully ended. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, heart pounding. Somewhere in the chaos of memories, omissions, and carefully curated grief lay the real story. And he was going to find it, whether she wanted him to or not. One thought stayed with him, relentless. I may not have answers yet, but I know where to look next. And that was enough, for now. The pieces had begun to line up, slowly, painstakingly, like fragments of a puzzle he wasn't sure he wanted complete. Each document, message, and half-remembered conversation pointed toward a woman he thought he had known, but in truth had only glimpsed through carefully filtered layers of grief and control. He started with her emails, the ones Margot had flagged. Each subject line seemed mundane, banal even: lunch with Claire, trip confirmation, monthly report. But reading between the lines, a story began to emerge, one of agency, secrecy, and choices made without his knowledge. She had been cautious, deliberate. Every interaction, every decision that skirted his awareness, revealed a mind that moved independently, even when her outward presence suggested otherwise. He realized that much of what he believed, her devotion, her attentiveness, her vulnerability, had been curated for those around her, for him, for her mother. He thought back to the funeral, the days after, the routine of calls and transfers. Every act of apparent grief, every display of helplessness, had concealed a private life that continued elsewhere. He had been given glimpses, phone calls, letters, brief confessions, but never the whole picture. And perhaps that was deliberate. Perhaps some truths had been too volatile, too dangerous to share. The wife he remembered, the one who had smiled in quiet moments, who had joked softly when he faltered, who had leaned on him in ways he treasured, was only part of the story. Another part, hidden beneath layers of restraint and secrecy, had moved through life with her own rhythm, her own decisions, and her own moral compass. He discovered evidence of meetings he had never known about, relationships that had remained in the shadows, connections he had assumed were insignificant. Each revelation forced him to reconstruct her life, not as a continuation of his grief, but as an independent narrative, one in which he had been peripheral at best. And yet, he found traces of love as well. Small acts, subtle kindnesses, moments of intimacy hidden in plain sight. The contrast was jarring. She had loved, in her own way, but not always him, not always the way he imagined. Loyalty had never been one-directional. Trust had been conditional, fragile, shaped by circumstances he hadn't understood. He felt a strange mixture of anger and awe. How could someone live so fully and yet remain invisible to the person closest to them? How could a woman navigate life with such careful precision that even those who love her most never grasped the whole truth? Her silence, once comforting, now felt suffocating. Each unanswered question, each pause in memory, each oblique reference he had accepted without protest now revealed itself as deliberate omission. She had chosen what he could know and what he could never touch. And yet, it wasn't cruelty, not entirely. It was preservation, survival, a way to move through the world without dragging the ones around her into complications they weren't prepared to handle. Her mother's influence had guided the narrative, but the wife herself had carved the private path that made such control possible. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of realization pressing down. For 7 years, he had mourned a version of her that was partly fiction, partly curated grief. And now, confronted with the full spectrum of her life, what she revealed, what she concealed, he understood that the truth was as unsettling as it was illuminating. In the quiet of the evening, he felt the boundaries of grief and loyalty blur. He was no longer mourning simply because she was gone. He was mourning the lost understanding of who she truly had been, and the consequences of living a life guided by partial truths. The documents, the messages, the faint traces of her private choices, all of it painted a portrait he could not ignore. A woman of strength, of contradiction, of secrecy, moving through the world in ways he had never imagined. And beneath the ache of revelation came clarity. He could no longer rely on her mother's narrative. The story had always been double-sided, layered with omission and intention. To know the truth, he would have to confront what remained hidden, not with confrontation alone, but with careful unraveling, patience, and courage. He closed the laptop slowly, letting the weight of her life settle in his mind. There was no turning back. He knew that the next step, the moment when all the shadows converged, was approaching. And he also knew this. The woman behind the silence had lived a life he could never fully enter, but he would not stop searching until he understood it completely, because only then would he know whether his loyalty had been noble or tragically misplaced. The day began like any other, quiet and deceptively ordinary. Sunlight spilled through the blinds, cutting slivers of warmth across the room, while he sat at the desk surrounded by stacks of papers, old emails, and bank statements. For the first time in years, he felt the precarious tension of anticipation, the weight of revelation pressing down with an almost physical force. He had traced every lead, followed every thread, cross-checked every date. Margot's guidance, the gaps in correspondence, the inconsistencies in the transfer history, all of it had brought him here, to the edge of the story that had defined his life for 7 years. And now, the truth was ready to break. He opened an old folder, the one he had kept hidden under the bottom drawer for fear of its implications. Inside were documents, receipts, and letters that had been waiting for him, evidence she had left behind intentionally or by accident. The first paper he pulled out contained a travel itinerary, stamped and confirmed, dated months after the end he had believed in. There were hotel reservations, flight confirmations, and a trail of her movements that no one had acknowledged. He held his breath, reading each line carefully. She had been alive, moving quietly through the world, making decisions, navigating her life in ways he could not imagine. His chest tightened. The truth he had long suspected now pressed against him with brutal clarity. His grief, his payments, his loyalty, they had all been directed at a carefully constructed illusion. Then came the letters, handwritten notes, folded and tucked inside envelopes, some addressed to friends, others simply unsigned. The handwriting was hers, unmistakable, full of life and intent. One note read simply, "I must go where I am needed, even if it hurts those I love. Please understand." Another contained no apology, only a careful explanation of why she could not stay, and why the story he had been living, her mother's narrative, was incomplete. He read each note twice, then 3 times. The words did not absolve confusion or the loss, but they explained it. She had chosen a life apart from the one he imagined, one that required silence and absence. It wasn't death that had claimed her. It was self-preservation, autonomy, a refusal to be pinned down by the expectations and grief of others. As he pieced together the timeline, he realized how meticulously her mother had managed the narrative. Every phone call, every reminder, every carefully crafted expression of grief had kept him compliant. He had thought it was loyalty, devotion, and love, but it had been performance orchestrated for him, for her, and perhaps for reasons he was only beginning to understand. Anger rose first, a slow burn of betrayal mixed with grief. How could she have hidden this? How could her mother have guided him into believing in a story that wasn't entirely true? But alongside the anger was another emotion, awe at the courage it took to navigate a life in secret, to maintain agency even as she vanished from the world he thought he shared with her. He felt the full weight of his own choices, years of compliance, years of silent loyalty, years of unexamined acceptance. But there was clarity now, sharp and unflinching. He understood that loyalty without awareness could be more dangerous than betrayal, that grief could be manipulated without force, that love could coexist with profound absence. And in that clarity, he found a measure of peace. Not closure, not resolution, but understanding. The woman he loved and thought he had lost had lived her life according to her own terms. He had mourned not the dead, but the boundaries of knowledge, the limits of trust, the fragility of perception. He gathered the documents, notes, and itineraries into one stack, feeling the weight of truth in his hands. He could not change the past. He could not undo the grief, the payments, the years of unknowing. But he could acknowledge it, accept it, and moved forward with the knowledge of what had truly been. As evening fell, painting the room in shadows, he picked up the phone once more, not to call her mother, not to demand explanations, but to finally answer the questions that had been haunting him from the beginning. Some truths, he realized, demanded confrontation, not with anger, but with attention, patience, and courage. And now he had them all. He exhaled, letting the tension in his chest ease just slightly. The story, the mystery, the carefully curated grief, it had all surfaced. And though the costs had been high, he understood at last. Living with truth, even when it's uncomfortable and incomplete, is the only path to freedom. Because some lives never truly end, they echo in the choices of those left behind, in the loyalty given, and in the courage it takes to finally see the story for what it is. And for the first time in 7 years, he felt ready to keep moving forward. The apartment was quiet now, almost unnaturally so. The documents lay stacked on the table, carefully organized, a tangible record of everything he had discovered. He had spent hours tracing her steps, following the hidden threads of her life, and yet the answers brought only a muted sense of closure. The emotional weight of 7 years lingered, settling in his chest like sediment that no amount of revelation could fully wash away. He walked slowly through the rooms, noticing the small signs of absence he had lived with for so long. The coffee mug she had favored, now a silent artifact on the counter. The faint scent of her perfume in the closet, lingering stubbornly despite the years. These remnants were neither comforting nor accusing. They simply existed, echoing a life that had never truly intersected with his in the way he had imagined. The payments had stopped, but the habit lingered in his mind. Every month for 7 years, he had surrendered a small piece of himself, obedience, loyalty, love, and grief, without ever questioning the cost. And now, in the wake of truth, he understood how much he had given, and how much of it had been guided by absence and omission rather than honesty. He thought of her mother, of course. The careful orchestration, the subtle control, the quiet insistence that he remain compliant. There was no anger left, not really, only understanding. Grief and manipulation had intertwined so completely that it was impossible to separate them. She had acted with purpose, but he realized he had also acted with willful trust, choosing to comfort a narrative over the complexity of reality. He sat down in the chair by the window, watching the light fade outside. The shadows grew long, and the city beyond seemed indifferent to the unraveling of his life. He felt the truth settle like dust on everything he had built, the marriage he remembered, the wife he mourned, the loyalty he had shown. All of it existed now in sharper, more complicated relief. Nothing was as simple as it had seemed, and yet he felt a strange kind of liberation. The illusions had been lifted, the carefully maintained story had been dismantled, and what remained was his life. Unvarnished, uncertain, but undeniably his own. There were no tidy resolutions, no comforting narratives. There was only understanding, acceptance, and a faint, fragile possibility of moving forward without illusion. He reflected on what the experience had taught him, a lesson neither obvious nor preachy, but undeniable. Grief can be a cage as easily as it can be a sanctuary. Loyalty can be noble, but it can also blind. And the only way to honor the past is to face it honestly, however unsettling that truth may be. The phone remained on the table, silent. He didn't need to call anyone. Not her mother, not Margot, not even the traces of the wife he had thought he knew. He had what he needed. The truth, as much as it could be known, and the clarity to live with it. He stood, stretching, feeling the subtle weight of responsibility lift slightly from his shoulders. Outside, the city continued its rhythm, indifferent yet alive. He could not change the past. He could not reclaim lost years. But he could live with knowledge, with awareness, and with the freedom that comes from finally seeing things as they are. Some questions would remain. Some memories would sting. But in the stillness of that apartment, surrounded by evidence and absence, he understood. Exposure does not erase grief, but it reshapes it. And sometimes that is all one can ask of truth. He turned away from the window, toward the quiet rooms, and let the shadows fall where they may. The story had ended, but the life it left behind, his life, was only beginning.